I want AI to make my podcast sound better. I don't want it to like recreate the music I want to listen to, or the, I don't want it to write a book for me. I want people to write books, but I'm happy
Mm,
for it to tidy my podcast up. But
yeah.
that's the way it's going. But there we go. So I'll record a separate intro, mate, that I kind of like plonk on top, and in that
Okay.
I'll give a bit of overview of the conversation. I'll let people know what's coming up. I'll talk about the book and do all that sort of intro stuff, and then that means we can just kind of like dive in and have a chat and just
Mm,
see where it goes. Yeah,
that
if
sounds good.
that's all right with yourself. Wonderful.
Sounds
So
good.
yeah, I'll intro you, mate, and we'll dive straight in. This is another episode of the Proper Mental Podcast, and my guest today is Dr. Benji Waterhouse. How are you, mate?
I'm good, thanks. And yeah, thanks for having me on.
Oh, mate, no, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to meet you. It's really interesting to get the opportunity to speak to someone who works in psychiatry, because I feel like there's not loads of you kind of doing the rounds in media. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's become in the last few years, like, I don't know, every GP seems to have a massive Instagram following. They love a TikTok, don't they, the old GPs? But there's not a load of psychiatrists that are sort of active. So it's great to get the opportunity to sort of pick your brains about stuff.
Yeah, I wonder
Why
why.
that is, but yeah, I know what you mean. There's Max Pemberton. Do you know Max? He's very good. And I know
I
you've had
don't know
Ben
Max.
Cave
No.
as well, who's written his great book. But
Yeah,
yeah, I do know what you mean. Yeah, I know what you mean.
yeah. It could probably do with a bit more of it, really, because there are a lot of accounts that are maybe a bit more sort of critical of psychiatry. But it's if you went just on like social media, it's like very one sided. It's quite an unbalanced thing. People have very strong, I suppose, really just strong opinions about the field that you work in, don't they?
Um,
I guess they do. I guess that maybe makes sense though when you think that psychiatrists do have unique power over people's basic human rights that other doctors don't. So it's kind of right that people think about what we do because, you know,
who knows? We could be on the wrong side of
history.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and
If
people's
you just look at the
um,
history,
With
ex-
psychiatry, like inevitably, whenever you look back, we've considered what psychiatrists have done, be that kind of drilling holes into people's heads or trying to cure them by near drowning or spinning them on chairs or whatever the thing that we now consider very mad was. Um, and, I think it would be naive to think that we'd reached the end of understanding now and that we had it just right. So I think it's good that people critique and
yeah.
are still thoughtful of, how helpful what we do really is.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I suppose so much is down to like individual experience. Do you know what I mean? Like, but everyone practices their own field of medicine differently and individually. And if I had like three or four, I don't know, shit haircuts, I'd probably not like any barbers. Like it's that sort of thing, isn't it? If we depends on the
mm,
individual experience. But
What's quite unusual about psychiatry is because we do know so little and outcomes to some extent seem kind of almost independent of the psychiatrist at times. I know amazing psychiatrists who get poor outcomes and I know awful psychiatrists who get great outcomes. So sometimes when you have that range and then there was that slightly alarming story of that fake doctor who worked as a consultant psychiatrist for 20 years and no one even noticed. And so it's this kind of because we are still trying to get some fundamental understanding of what mental illness even is and what maybe helps with it. It means that there is that range. So you get very biological psychiatrists on the one hand who will just kind of medicate for everything, and then you get very social psychiatrists who kind of interpret everything through a more social lens or psychological lens. And there's kind of space for all of it because the jury's still out on what's right there.
yeah, yeah, and I suppose in anything really, isn't it? Like if sometimes it's a case of like if something works, it doesn't really matter why. Do you know what I mean? If someone's in distress, if someone's having problems, and then suddenly they're more able to cope, or their problems seem less, or the volume's turned down, or whatever, then it doesn't really matter, right?
It doesn't. I mean,
Individual level, no, even if that
Mm.
that benefit is placebo, but you've got to be careful with that because just because something works for someone for a reason that's maybe not even to do with the thing, say if it were placebo, I don't think that's necessarily a reason to roll that treatment out for everyone.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very much so. What led you to this world then, mate? What was your interest? How come you went down this way?
um,
Well, I think I'm probably not the only. In fact, I know I'm not the only psychiatrist. I think I have as like a lot of people, I have a very loving but slightly dysfunctional family of my own, and I think I probably went into it with this fantasy that I was going to get the secret codes to kind of fix everyone, and make my family happy. Then you get into it and you realize, oh yeah, no, there aren't really any secret codes, and yeah, so I think that's what led me to be in that world, and also being around certain things. Some people run a mile, don't they, from kind of distress or mental illness, and are even sometimes scared by it. But that's never been a problem I've had, and it's kind of sometimes quite odd to me. I think that I actually feel quite at home sometimes on a psychiatric ward.
Yeah, yeah. Just fit right in, mate. Fit right in. Yeah. It's Did you feel like because with it being, we kind of already touched on the field of psychiatry. There's there's so many unknowns, and there's so many different factors that are so individual to the people that you're working with. Like, is it something that, yeah, and this, I don't know, now I'm saying this, it might even sound like a daft question, but is it something that like all the training and the years of medical school kind of like prepared you for in a way? Because it must be surreal, even with all the training and the being a reg and work, doing all the different things. The first day that you're like, okay, like now I'm going to deal with a person that's experiencing this thing. That must be quite an intense first day. First of many days. But
definitely. I think
There's a real
there's a real
wake up call when you move from textbooks to real life, because I feel like at medical school, we would do role plays with patients, and in these scenarios, we were sort of almost led to believe that if we got the diagnosis right, we could initiate the treatment or refer them for the right therapy, and we kind of believe that they just sort of like walk off into the sunset. But the grim reality of NHS psychiatry and of real life, I suspect, is not really like that. Even if you did have availability of these, therapy options or whatever it is, and people weren't just going to wait for years on waiting lists, as obviously happens. Um, so yeah, and that's just something that I have really wondered if the answers to people's lives, the answers to people's messy lives really do lie within the pages of medical school textbooks. And I do sometimes think that we were sometimes led to believe, led to believe that problems of living were more biological than I suspect is actually the truth of it. And I suppose the best example of that is at medical school, we were always taught this serotonin theory of depression, and we had to practice counseling patients and saying to them, "Oh, you have this thing called depression, which is just due to having low, you know, levels of this neurotransmitter called serotonin." And only now are psychiatrists say, "Oh, and that can be, rectified by taking this serotonin related medicine, this SSRI." And only now are psychiatrists sort of admitting that there's no reliable evidence for any of that. Um, so yeah,
mm,
that's something that you kind of, and you realize it in a very real world sense when you're looking in front of your patients and you're initiating these treatments and you're referring them for these therapies, and even when they get them, the outcomes are often very marginal.
yeah, yeah. I suppose sometimes you got to take what you can get, right? And, yeah,
you
given
certainly
the
Do, and it's
circumstances. But
know, you certainly
have to take what you can get exactly, and that's what you do. I've made my peace with. I always think it's kind of interesting because I certainly got more thank you cards and chocolates when I worked in other medical specialities. You know,
but as you say, you just
got to celebrate the victories because every now and then people do get better, and it's just kind of more rewarding when they do. There was a really beautiful fable that a therapist of mine, taught me to kind of make my peace with the frustrations of our best available treatments, I suppose. And it's called the starfish fable, and it goes that there's an old man walking down this beach, and on this beach there are like millions of starfish that have been kind of beached on it. They've been caught out by a high tide or whatever. And he comes up to this little boy who's in the middle of the beach. He's throwing these starfish into the sea. And the old man says to the boy, "What are you doing, son?" He says, "Oh, I'm saving these starfish." And the old man kind of chuckles to himself and says, "But look, son, there's like millions of starfish, and there's only one of you. What difference can you make?" And the little boy picks up a starfish, chucks it into the sea, and says, "I just made a difference to that one." I think that's a nice way of seeing it. You just got to focus on the starfish.
Yeah, that's really lovely. Like a really lovely way of looking at it. And I suppose, if we're thinking of humans rather than starfishes, sometimes the human goes back into the community and then positively impacts someone else in the community, and the community like helps to kind of almost heal itself, for want of a better expression. It's that there's always something nice about that, isn't it? You never know that one person that you help, you never know what they're going to go on and do for other people, and there's something quite nice about that as well, I think.
Mm.
So we've got a slight little lag between us there, mate. So if I'm sort of jumping in and talking over you,
I just didn't say.
If
I
my
just didn't have
pauses
anything
are
else to
too
say.
long, yeah.
I just didn't have anything else to say.
It wasn't really a question, I suppose. Yeah. Did you find that with going in, from the start to now, how did your like approach change at all? Because it seemed to in your book, which we'll probably reference a lot today, sort of you were sort of you were, I suppose, confronted with the realities of, the pressures of working in that environment and the NHS and all those sorts of things, that there was almost like you had to readjust a little bit to kind of how you navigated all of that.
Certainly. I mean,
And that's the slightly disturbing thing, there's evidence does show that, a doctor becomes less empathy over a career, not more, which I always think is kind of alarming. And I would see that in myself. I remember when I first turned up, for example, in my first day, and I was really shocked at this seemingly callous, uncaring boss that I had, who in the book I've called Dr. Glick, and how on that first day we discharged someone from the ward who was thinking of jumping out of her bedroom window. My boss discharged her because she only lived on the second floor. And I had no idea that we'd be allocating, these resources, obviously, according to whether jumping from a certain floor flat would create a big enough splat. But very sadly, these are very much the sort of dark factors that come into the mental calculation when deciding who get these precious few beds. And as we know, the number of psychiatric beds have gone down from 70,000 in the 1980s to less than 20,000 now. So what are you going to do? And so very quickly I would see these traits in myself, when you'd get kind of rude emails for admitting patients who people thought were not that risky, or you get kind of berated for not discharging someone quickly enough or whatever. So yeah, I would quickly inhabit these ways myself, which worried me and continues to worry me. Now I'm a consultant, and I sometimes see myself doing other seemingly, sometimes from the outside, callous things, like refusing people entry who are desperate to get hospital because I think they're not that bad, which is basically my main job at the moment, working in emergency psychiatry, which I do feel conflicted about.
Yeah, I suppose it's just so tricky, isn't it? And there's always, there's just so many other factors going on, and decisions have to be made, and that's where we're at, isn't it? That's where we're at. Yeah. There was a few.
I'm paying for better though, and I guess that was why I thought it might be good to write a book so people were a little bit aware of the context to all of this, and that psychiatrists generally aren't just uncaring people who don't want to help On the contrary, I think most of us go into it with that motivation, but then it's kind of quite hard with the resources we have available to us.
Yeah, very
For
much so, yeah.
28%. They say mental illness accounts for 28% of the overall disease burden, but we get just 13% of funding. And so you really feel that on the front line.
Yeah, sort of working with a hand tied behind your back, really, in some respects. Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, it was really interesting to me, and I thought bring it while we're talking about training and new to the job, that in your book that there was actually some self-defense training when you first started as well. That was part of the part of the preparing you to work in this field, right?
Yeah, it still is. Yeah.
It's still very much one of the first things you do, which is
Again, that was
another thing I slightly wanted to push back on, because I think society does overestimate the dangerousness of our patient group, certainly around things like, say, people with diagnoses like schizophrenia. I think people's associations of that label are all kind of like axe-wielding murderers with split brains, But actually, sorry, I got a cough. Yeah, actually, a boss taught me in my training that actually people with that diagnosis are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators of it. And she told me that actually, actually things like alcohol and drugs are a far bigger risk factor for things like homicide than severe mental illness like schizophrenia is. So my boss taught me I was technically safer being at a psychiatric patient's home than I was at a psychiatrist's house party.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that, right? Yeah, very much so. I suppose that's where
that training did feel a bit disproportionate and slightly unhelpful, because it just fed into these ideas that our patients were dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. That's again that sort of stigma's everywhere, isn't it? Is how people think of someone with a diagnosis of, I work in mental health myself. We work in the community, and we tend to work with people, hopefully intervening before they would walk through your door, or maybe sometime afterwards, once they're back in the community, is kind of where we're involved. I spend my days with people with like all these different labels and diagnoses and stuff like that. It's never, I've never felt unsafe. I've never, you forget, don't you? You don't even realize. But to some people, if you're not used to it, these words are scary. There's I think the media has a lot to answer for, or maybe historically, certainly.
It's historical. I mean, like the only time you ever tend to hear about that word is when something's gone very, very wrong. On the rare occasion that someone with that diagnosis, say, kills someone, as most tragically happened, I think most took with quite a high level of profile was in Nottingham, that patient Valdo Calacane, who stabbed those 3 people. So it's surprising that when people only ever hear schizophrenia in that context, that they generalize,
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, there was with I suppose with the purpose of maybe busting a few myths, actually, there was a few things I wanted to ask you about, like roles of psychiatry. And I thought, rather than try and be clever and blend them into the conversation, I'll just ask you about them, right? Because I think it would be useful. They're things that things that kind of like come up for various reasons on this, on this show over the years. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is the process of sectioning someone under the Mental Health Act. And the reason I'm kind of asking about this is because I think it's really, really massively misunderstood that, how it all works. And I think that, certainly using my own experience as an example, I was very, very ill with my mental health, and I tried to take my own life. And I didn't talk about that at all with anyone. And if someone had said to me, like, why didn't you talk about your mental health? I would have been genuinely scared that if I disclosed the things I was thinking about doing to myself, then that I would be sectioned. And I used to hide behind that thought very, very confidently. But in reality, my only knowledge of the process was, reading One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when I was at school, and the episode of Peep Show where they try and section each other to steal a pub. That was it. And yet that was so like strong in my mind, and that's come up time and time again. And I was wondering if we could just talk it through from the professional's point of view to almost shine a light on it. It's just, you know, it's not that easy to get sectioned, is it? It doesn't just happen.
No, certainly.
And certainly, and increasingly, the number of there's now so few beds that, you know, increasingly the main admissions are coming from people being sectioned. Like I think it's always quite an interesting paradox in mental health, whereby the more unwell you are, the most unwell people are like so disconnected from reality they think that they're fine, which is kind of quite complicated, because you'll get people saying things like, I don't need to come into hospital, I don't have schizophrenia, which is exactly the sort of thing someone with schizophrenia would say, or someone without it, which can make things quite confusing, you know. And so in the same way, it's why if someone comes to you, when I was working this weekend, and this was basically how the weekends usually go during my own calls, and people are coming seeking help, saying, I'm in a crisis, I really need to come into hospital. The fact that they have that level of insight, we will see as a reassuring sign, and then we'll effectively be like, you can't be that bad, so no, you can be managed in the community, you know, which is a very strange arrangement. But yeah, to be sectioned, it would rarely be that second person I described, you know, someone who still had that insight. You know, it's usually a section is reserved for. So there needs to be, to section someone, you need to have evidence of some sort of mental disorder. And on top of that, there also needs to be some level of associated risk to the person or society. You need to satisfy those two criteria. So just having, you know, saying a bit of depression, you're never gonna get sectioned for that. Yeah, if the depression was so severe, like what it sounds like you were maybe describing, I'm not sure if you would consider your suicidality in the context of depression or not, but if you say had depression and you were feeling suicidal,
Again,
millions of people in the country right now already, maybe not millions, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. So you're not going to get sectioned for that alone. Tons of people have suicidal thoughts, and very, very few of them will ever go into a psychiatric hospital. You then basically, to persuade someone to think you were that bad that you needed sectioning, the level of perceived risk to yourself in that situation would have to be very high. So it would be like if you had made a very punchy, serious attempt to end your life, like took a whopping overdose, and had then been, you know, someone had walked in on you despite you making all these plans to not be found, or you tried to hang yourself from, you know, really from a height and the rope had snapped or the beam had snapped, but otherwise you would have died. Then that sort of level of seriousness, not just having thoughts, oh, maybe that you might maybe think about killing yourself, that would probably be the threshold where that would be activated in that first scenario. But I would say most sections are probably are usually more for in the realm of psychosis, and that's usually where someone say
they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia,
and is having, you know, symptoms in the context of that they're finding unsettling or are endangering themselves or others, and they're not engaging with a community plan, and they're not open to the idea of taking medication, which can sometimes help. That's when, as a kind of last resort, people will use the Mental Health Act to kind of take matters out of their hands and take them into hospital.
Right. Yeah.
I
mean,
that Peep Show, remind me what the Peep Show scenario is, because I think that's slightly unrealistic. Because also another thing in terms of like the logistics of it, you need to have. I mean, I suppose the humour of that scene comes from the fact that neither of them are sectionable, right? Neither of them are sectionable, obviously, because they're both fine. But like, the other thing, just in terms of the logistics, I think he just turns up. Does he turn up with a psychiatrist and a social worker? I think it's probably unlikely that he does, but he does. But you need to have three people all to agree as well, which is a new thing to kind of get away from abuses of the past, where basically you would have a single person who would sometimes just say, and sometimes, you know, there are reports of times when people would just section their friends, psychiatrists would just section their friends' wives so that their friends could continue having their affairs without getting it in the neck, kind of thing. Charles Dickens tried to get his psychiatrist mate to do that. So there are now three. People all need to agree, which sort of hopefully removes that opportunity for abuse.
Yeah, very much so. Oh no, there's only one person they're talking to in Peep Show. They're trying to steal a pub in that episode. They get left a pub and they decide if they can get the other one sectioned, then the other one can keep the pub, and they just sort of threaten to section each other, and no one gets sectioned. So, but yeah, that's it. It's you mentioned as well, like, psychosis and stuff there, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, and particularly like the delusions that are associated with it. And is there any this might be a bit of a random question, but is there any reason why, or any sort of connection to the individual experience in the delusions and the delusions themselves? And what I mean by that is, are they like linked to anything, or is it like just a complete is it just the brain pulling stuff out of nowhere, or is it, I don't know, if I spend a lot of time watching, I don't know, Formula One, is my delusions likely to involve cars or engines? Or do you know what I'm trying to say here, Benji? I'm not quite sure what I am myself. But is there any sort of link to it?
Sometimes there is, yeah. Sometimes there very much is, and it's kind of, I'm trying to think of a good example. But also sometimes you can think of it in terms of, some people see psychosis or as a defense from reality. There's that story that I wrote about in the book, where there was a character called Barbara, who was a very kind of middle-aged, unwanted, single American woman who society just didn't really have any interest in. And so, interestingly, when she had her psychotic episode, she developed the delusional idea, this so-called erotomanic delusion, that Harry Styles was in love with her. And that's when she flew over from America in a wedding dress to marry Harry Styles. And you can see how, in that context, that delusion serves a real purpose for her, as someone who was kind of unloved and unwanted. And all of a sudden, she kind of believes that, one of the most glamorous men in the world wants her, and so, which is why you sometimes, as a psychiatrist, sometimes feel when people have these not unpleasant delusional ideas that actually are sometimes nicer than their realities. You feel a kind of unkind sometimes when you're treating them, so that they can come back to reality and realize how grim and empty their lives sometimes are, But yeah, there's meaning in it a lot. I always think, usually, so that's in the context of like grandiose delusions, where kind of your delusional beliefs will kind of like elevate you in some sort of way. But it's not always like that, obviously. Well, thinking in terms of meaning, so there's a really interesting story I always think is in the context of, the madness of King George. Do you remember that king? I forget which king he was, but King George is something, and he had he developed delusional ideas, but he was already the king, so he didn't really have anywhere to go in terms of grandiosity. He was already the king of England. And interestingly, I always think his delusional idea was that he was a farmer. He was an everyman. That's what he thought, is that he was just an ordinary person, which is kind of interesting, because I wonder if that served a purpose in some ways, because he managed to escape the trappings of being responsible for the whole of the kingdom. And he just got to, through this way, he got to be a kind of an everyman. So he didn't have delusions of grandeur. He had delusions of mediocrity, which I suppose can also be a blessing in some ways.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because I think there is this kind of look when we talk about mental illness in particular of like a madness of just someone's head breaking and suddenly all this chaos ensures, but the human brain, a lot of this stuff is just kind of like, it's a protective mechanism that is maybe a bit out of control, or like, so anxiety, for example, we know that anxiety disorder is an extreme version of something that's very useful when it's not extreme, right? So yeah, I suppose of like digging around in the idea that some aspects of mental illness, some of the ones that would be thought of maybe as more scary, is not actually, we can kind of almost see like the Harry Styles lady, you can kind of see that makes sense, and there's a process to it.
And it just depends where you are on this spectrum, as we've said, as a psychiatrist, because there'll be some colleagues of mine who will say consider all that I've just said is total nonsense, and think that all this ever is kind of, you've got, it's like an imbalance of dopamine, for example, which is one of the hypotheses of psychosis. But then you'll get other people who I'm slightly more sympathetic to, who will have a slightly more thoughtful, more what you might consider kind of psychological or psychoanalytical way of conceptualizing this. And I guess they'll be on the other side. And I think I see myself as somewhere in the middle, probably.
Yeah, when there's like two opposing views, somewhere in the middle is usually where the magic happens, right? That's normally the best place to be. But I kind of I'm really interested in this idea of like, as a society, what we deem as madness, and there was a piece in the book as well where you talked about people in having very strong views about conspiracy theories, which kind of like blew up around the time of the pandemic. And some of the things that people were talking about were absolutely bizarre, and yet it's not. How is it that someone who's going around saying, like, I don't know, Tom Hanks drinks lizard blood to stay young, how is that different from the lady who wants to meet Harry Styles? Like, those things to me are equally bonkers, for want of a better term. And yet society is kind of, we're okay in one way to say, this person's just a conspiracy theorist, but this person's mad. Like, there's an element of, as we, particularly I suppose when we look at these things through history as well, as what's classed as being mad and what isn't. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, as I have reflected in the book, it is interesting, as you say. Think that the example that you just gave of drinking lizard blood, or I think especially that QAnon one, the idea that they were all like satanistic cannibals, paedophiles in the White House, does have the flavour of psychosis. It sounds so bizarre. But then I think maybe a thing that distinguishes a delusion from a conspiracy theory is just if enough people believe it. And also conspiracy theories don't generally cause that much dysfunction to people's lives. They just share their ideas on Instagram or with their other like-minded mates, but they generally don't get on aeroplanes or start knocking at the doors of people, like as Barbara was doing, And I suspect that's probably because they always say that the definition of a delusion is something held with delusional intensity. It's an unshakable belief that even when given evidence to the contrary, they'll still hold that belief. Whereas even with conspiracy theories, they're generally not held to quite that degree, and people will retain a little bit of an even if just 1%, that maybe it's not actually that. Whereas in delusion, it's 100%.
Yeah, certainly. That sort of, no, that makes sense. And, for something to be more internal and personal, for one person to experience rather than a group of people to believe an idea.
Slight kind of social contagion, fun idea that people sort of get on board with.
Yeah, sure. And the idea, when you were saying that delusions there sort of defy logic, that changed in your approach, it seemed, from the book, like over the course of your working life, is how you approached people with delusions. Would I be right in saying that, Benji?
Definitely.
Because I do think when I first started, I behaved more like a barrister than I did as a psychiatrist, and I was still caught up in this idea that I could kind of use logic to change irrational minds, and so I would, if a patient said the food was poisoned, I would eat it, or if they said that the water had been tampered with, I would drink it. But I realized that that psychosis always finds a loophole. They'd say things like, "Oh, it's not been poisoned yet," or "You've taken the antidote," or "You're not human," or whatever the thing was. There'd always be a way of of explaining it away. And so, yeah, I did. And generally, when you using logic against people, just generally just tends to antagonize them, if anything, and just make that therapeutic relationship worse. And that really needs to be preserved if you're going to work with them in any meaningful way. So I learned one little creative kind of adjustment, which was there was a guy called Richard Lucas, a quite creative psychologist, spoke about. Instead, it could be more therapeutic to sometimes join a patient on what's called their psychotic wavelength. And I always think there was one example of this where it worked out quite well. It was a guy who unusually this was someone who was dangerous, but again, he was in this place called a psychiatric intensive care unit, a PQ, and that is for people who are like that. That is for those minority of people who can sometimes be dangerous. And he was in there because he believed he was a vampire. No, he believed he was a werewolf, sorry, and he was trying to drink other people's blood. And so that's why he was in there. And he was in this seclusion room, which have kind of replaced the infamous padded cells of the old asylums. And he was in there after he tried to drink when he'd first come in, he'd let us take his blood, but then he got angry when he wasn't allowed to drink the contents of the vials. And so he went for one of the nurses, and then he had to get chucked in the seclusion room. And you have to do these regular checks to see if people are kind of a bit calmer and not going to do that sort of thing again, and see if they can come out and restore a little bit of liberty and at least be free to walk around the ward, rather than just be in a single room. And when I went in with this whole bunch of nurses, this patient who I've just called Femi in the book, he kind of jumped up and he said he could feel the beast coming on, and he was about to charge at us. And instead of everyone just physically restraining him and injecting with a sedative, which is sadly how that will often play out, I thought, well, now's as good a time as any to try another way, And so I said to him, hang on a second, Femi. I said, I didn't think werewolves came out during daylight hours, and it's only just after 8 a.m. now. And he looked around. He was really disorientated. And I wasn't surprised he was confused because there's no windows in there or anything. And I showed him, I just showed him on my watch. It was the morning. He went, oh, right, sorry. Then he just sat back down again.
And then,
oh, mate,
yeah, it was like magic. And then me and the rest of the team let out a huge sigh of relief and just thank God we weren't working the night shift.
yeah, very much so. Crikey, yeah. But no, but it makes perfect sense if someone's got that unmovable belief in that thing to that thing can then be a part of building that connection with them to change the situation. Yeah, it makes
and obviously there are some risks to that, because some people would think that if you always do that you're only going to kind of enable it or kind of, because ultimately you probably do need to come out of a place of believing you are a werewolf and need to drink other people's blood if you're going to be going home at some point. But yeah, we certainly seem like in the dementias, for example, people are much more ready. I think of kind of confused people who say, for example, think they're still at school, or and on the ward, everyone will be like, oh yeah, come on, Doris, let's get you back to class or whatever. People seem more okay with it in that context than they do in younger people. Yeah.
there's a value sometimes.
There's a value every now and then. Yeah. As I say, when there's so few answers, you've just got to be creative and see what works at every given moment, really.
Yeah, and it's probably worth us talking today as well. Something else that you wrote about in your book was how your work and a lot of these things that we're talking about, how that kind of impacted your own mental well-being, and that was something you kind of had to take a look at, Benji, right? Was that something that kind of crept up on you over time through the course of just going to work and dealing with these things?
Yeah,
I do think being
in this world, around people.
and misery is your day job. I think a lot of it inevitably can stick to you, and psychiatrists are known to have notoriously bad mental health, and
I kind of think that.
to where I first was made aware of this when during one of my early supervision sessions when I first started, I asked my boss if we could open a window in the psychiatric hospital where we were working, and she said, "Oh, the windows they don't open, they don't open up here to stop people jumping out of them." And I said to her, "What, even in the psychiatrist's offices?" And she said, "Especially in the psychiatrist's offices." And
Wow.
psychiatrists are known to have notoriously bad mental health, but even that is kind of slightly chicken and egg, because I think whilst being in this world, the stuff can stick to you to some degree. As I have sort of said at the beginning of this podcast, psychiatry does tend to attract slightly troubled souls in the first place, because there was an interesting bit of research done in the British Medical Journal that found that medical students wanting to go into psychiatry were already more depressive than medical students wanting to go into other medical specialities. So
Okay.
maybe the kind of logic is, if you're going to end up in a psychiatric hospital one way or another, you may as well get paid for it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
Yeah, might as well be able to leave at the end of the day.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but were you kind of like aware that you were like sort of burning out a bit in real time, Benji? Was that how that worked for you?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean,
I was worrying about, as I write about, I was just feeling exhausted all the time and not able to sleep and lying awake at night worrying about my patients who I'd say want to get admitted, but there weren't any beds, so I'd be kind of living with that risk and worry on my shoulders, and I was getting quite dark thoughts myself at one point, of just kind of checking out altogether. And
it was interesting because
I saw my GP at the time, and they prescribed me antidepressants. And again, this was kind of, I was thinking, is this a chemical problem, or is this something else? And I said to my therapist, I said, "Do you think I'm depressed?" And he said, "No, Benji, I think you're an NHS psychiatrist."
and I think
Spoke to, I think there was some wisdom in that, and so I didn't actually, in that, you know,
I didn't take the medicine. That
actually just fought for some time off, and then with that time off, you know, I did feel much better, which I think means
Mm.
that probably was the culprit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's
but
one
then
of,
I've
like as
done this.
modern human, we talk about like a mental. Sorry, mate.
No, I was just going to say, but then
And then, unfortunately, then the pandemic happened, and I had to go back after a fortnight. But I still had a good fortnight of feeling better. Yeah. And now I'm just part time, which
Good
is the only
40.
way that I can do it. Yeah, and that works for me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's yeah, it's it's like we talk about like a mental health crisis and all this sort of stuff going on, and like fact of the matter is, a huge factor in that is humans having the time to kind of unpack some of this stuff and unpick it and just have a rest from it. And I think that's probably got just as much to do with it all than all the other things that get talked about. It's hard to get off the treadmill, isn't it, and kind of yeah, and sort stuff out. But yeah, that's the modern condition. How was it? What was it like sitting down to write about all of this, and all the different like people that you've worked with, and how to bring all that together and to kind of look back at it all? It must have been a bit of a process to like sift through all those years of work and experience and all that sort of stuff, and bring it together into like an actual, a
mm,
book that's really good by the way. But
um, yeah, no,
It was a generally really enjoyable process. I've always found, like, I find storytelling, um,
helpful.
host this international night called The Moth, which is kind of originated in New York, but it's kind of all over the world now. And I'm one of the hosts for the London one. And one of my jobs as host is to sort of open with a kind of a story at the beginning. So I think I kind of have always seen the value of storytelling, and I started just with short form stories like I would tell at the Moth, and then which made then telling, as you say, like that made the task of writing a slightly more daunting 80,000 word one a little bit less daunting, because I already had these building blocks of little stories that I'd tried telling, say. Um,
So yeah, and that's sort of how I did.
and I think, the patients are obviously all like, they're all amalgams of, the thousands of different people that I've seen over the years to protect confidentiality and everything. But I think they still do feel like very recognizable and like real people. And it's really sweet because people often message me on Instagram like asking how certain characters are doing now, just kind of I think I sense something
Yeah.
And
Yeah, very much.
there is an essential truth to them all. There's definitely an essential truth to them all. And it's interesting because you worry when you do start writing, especially about something as sensitive as mental health and people's stories, and you worry that you might get some complaints from patients. But interestingly, the only complaints I've had from patients have been that I didn't include their stories in my book.
Yeah. No, it's nice. People want to be written about. Yeah, that's a nice thing, right? Yeah, definitely.
If the tone is right. Yeah.
Yeah, fair one. Yeah, I know, did you take the book to Edinburgh, or was it something in Edinburgh that fueled the book? Which way round was that, mate?
In a really organic way. I did this online writing course, which I would always recommend. It sort of changed my life. It was called Curtis Brown Creative, and then at the end of that, and that was in lockdown when there wasn't so much to do. So that was like a great excuse just to get on with, because I'd always thought it'd be quite nice to write, but this was kind of a bit of time to actually do it in the evenings. So I did this course, and then at the end there was a tutor who'd read my work, suggested sending it to one of their agents, and they did. And they actually sent it to Adam Kay's agent, and then she replied within like the hour saying she loved it and she thought she could make it a success. And so it was all super straightforward. Then we just pitched it, and then had a big auction, and then picked my favorite publisher, and then sold the TV rights. Same thing, an auction for it, and yeah, now I'm doing the TV adaptation. But it was very surreal and straightforward, and I think I got very lucky, to be honest with you.
Yeah. When I got
the book deal, because they'd backed it, when I got the book deal, because like I felt like there was quite a bit of pressure on it, I then would like write the chapters, and then I took them up to Edinburgh to road test them in front of an audience first.
Right.
To check that tone, because as we've said, it's a real fine line if you're mixing humour with something potentially so serious. And an audience can be a helpful, if brutal, editor. So that's what I did. And if they've kind of found something funny, hopefully they'd laugh. I'd keep that bit in. And if they found something interesting, it was harder to gauge interest. But
Yeah. There's a real place for humour in, like as a mechanism, right, to kind of open up this conversation. And I think it's a really important thing, a really useful thing to get people thinking about the more challenging aspects, maybe in a different way.
Definitely, because
humour can make the intolerable more tolerable. And I was very lucky that my book did sell fairly well. It was like number 2 in the Sunday Times bestsellers list when it came out. And I think that's partly because it had this lightness to offset the darkness. I've got a funny feeling that people would not read it so enthusiastically if you didn't have some punchlines on the end. You just would struggle. I think that with my rooms in Edinburgh, when I sell out, tours in Edinburgh or whatever, I think you'd struggle to get these people in this room talking about schizophrenia and suicide for an hour if you didn't have any lightness there. I just don't think it's anything.
Yeah.
So it can be a real Trojan horse, And funny things do just happen in mental health, as they do in all jobs, Like, I don't know, like the time when I was once trying to section someone, and I was so tired on the section papers, I accidentally mixed up the box for the patient's name and my own, and technically sectioned myself.
Oh, mate, see, that's why you need 3 people to consider a section in, you see, in case it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, there you go, there you go. Mate, I'm conscious of your time. I'm going to let you go in a sec. There's one more thing I wanted to just have a brief, although to be honest, right at the end, this is probably a daft Pandora's box to open, but when I was like reading a little bit about yourself, I noticed it came up on Google that a few years ago you did a show about psychedelics, and I was just wondering like what your interest in that was, and how that sort of how that came about, really, because we don't, there's a big movement. There's a lot of talk about that at the moment, and I suppose it's a little bit unusual for a maybe it's not. Maybe I'm just presuming, but for a psychiatrist to be talking about these things.
Well, it just comes
Back to that thing, I was very frustrated by the marginal gains that we have currently with our available medications. And you hear all this hype around psychedelics. People were saying, one dose was the equivalent of 5 years of therapy. And, I thought if that's the case, NHS should really look into that, because it's nothing if not thrifty. And so then I got into I helped on this big trial looking at this stuff, psilocybin, which is like magic mushrooms, for so-called treatment-resistant depression, and that was comparing psilocybin with conventional antidepressants for treatment-resistant depression. And it was really interesting because I saw some magical things in that study, but also I think I learned I learned from it. Again, it comes back to this point that things don't always necessarily work for the reasons that we think they do. And I always think of this one case. There was someone who'd had a decade-long history of depression. She'd been on like 20 different antidepressants. Nothing had touched it, all at maximum doses. So she was eligible for the study, and she came in. She took the medicine. She put the mask on, the earphones in, and then just lay back in this kind of bed and just got slurped up, basically. And she didn't move for 6 hours, and so I kind of sensed that she'd got the good stuff, she was just so perfectly still. And and then about 6 hours later, so I just got to sit there as the so-called guide. My job was to guide people through this experience if tricky stuff came up, for example. You just got to chill out and read your book, basically. But then for 6 hours later, she took the eye mask off, took the earphones off, looked around and just said, "I think it's gone." And this depression that, like, all these previous meds had not managed to budge, had just gone like that. And it was as close to a medical miracle as I feel like I'd ever seen. And depression free for as long as we followed her up. And then just at the end of the study, several months later, just as when we would like meet all the participants to like say goodbye and stuff, but also we had to do this thing called the unblinding, where we would discover everyone, the researchers and the participant would discover what dose of medicine they'd received. And when we opened her envelope, we discovered that she'd received the placebo.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the power of the mind, eh? The power of the mind.
Yeah, and
It was kind of it's incredible, isn't it? But also, it shouldn't be so surprising because we know how huge the placebo effect is. That's why, obviously, all drugs have to be compared against that to show if they have any evidence base or not. And we know that there are huge expectancy effects, especially around medicines that are much hyped and there's a lot of interest around. Drugs that kind of are seen as more desirable or more expensive or harder to get a hold of or only reserved for the minority. Like, science evidence suggests that they just always work better than, say, cheaper drugs that are available to everyone that are kind of seen as a bit rubbish. They're just not pharmacology, even though they've got the same pharmacology. If you tell people, even with the same pharmacology, you tell people those two different stories, that first group, they will experience a more helpful benefit, And
Yeah, so that
That was kind of interesting, and I was worried, obviously, that would that with that information, like she would become depressed as quickly as she'd kind of got better. But she didn't really. She just sort of said she said she couldn't explain why she felt better, but she just did, and she wasn't going to kind of interrogate that too much. And again, for as long as we kind of checked in with her, she was depression free. So, but it did slightly burst my bubble with psychedelics because I feel like we're so desperate to find stuff that works in psychiatry. You know, we really are, and psychedelics have been tipped as a miracle cure for literally everything now at this point. You know,
uh, interestingly,
went to crunch the numbers at the end of the trial, it found that psychedelics actually, the psychedelic group only did as well as the group that received the escitalopram, a conventional antidepressant. And, you know, conventional antidepressants, we already know, are only have a marginal evidence base above placebo. So they're certainly not the magic pill that I suspect everyone wants them to be. Um,
Yeah.
but
hopefully this person, as I say, people
people find value in them and find them helpful, and so you're not going to argue with that. And hopefully one day there'll be an available treatment option in some capacity.
Yeah, I think it, just the idea that these things are being explored and being considered sort of gives people hope, doesn't it? And the fact that they can be trialed in that way and properly like looked into is really good. I've had I don't know if you know Dr. Rosalind Watts. I've had Ros Watts on the show.
yeah,
She
I'm
did a
friends with
lot of
her.
work
She
on the
was
trials.
she Yeah, it was that trial. It was that trial.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. So I've got an episode about that, and afterwards I spoke to Ian Roulier, who runs like Saipan Global, does sort of and they like sort of connect with people who've been through the trials and stuff like that. And I know Ian and Leone from there as well are really active in that space. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff. But mate, yes, wonderful. There you go.
It's a little bit grim.
It's just a little bit.
Grim. The one just like kind of little after it's just on my mind because I've just recently finished watching season 3 of the TV show Industry. Have you seen that?
I have, yeah, yeah.
Is that really grim?
Line because inevitably when there's like because one of the purposes of this more Eastern tradition of psychedelics is to kind of disconnect people from this kind of capitalist materialistic world that's probably actually not making us very happy and leaving us kind of quite empty. Is to move away from all of that. And so it's kind of grim when you see it in psychedelic research. Everyone's trying to patent these like natural molecules and to get rich quick off them. And there's even that scene that sort of speaks to that in Industry season 3 when they're having when that billionaire is having the ayahuasca experience, and then mid trip he's saying, "We need to monetize this shit."
Yeah, yeah. No, you see it a lot. We said before we started recording, I live near Liverpool, and there's sort of this big movement around Merseyside at the moment, and we'd call them like cosmic scousers. And there's also, you can go and do, I don't know, ayahuasca in Wavertree. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just like it's a mad old business. It's a mad old business. But there you go, mate. Thank you so.
Yeah, yeah.
No, thanks for having me.
Hey Tom, nice chatting with you.
Oh mate, no, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on. Let me just I'm just gonna hit record, mate, and then I'll say a proper goodbye off air.